One day I had a home, a husband, and a baby on the way. The next, I was sitting on a concrete curb outside a Walmart in Charlotte, North Carolina, with a 3-month-old strapped to my chest and $42 in my pocket. I keep thinking there must have been a moment where I could have stopped it, some door I walked through that I shouldn't have. But when I look back, I just see my own hands, reaching for things I thought were safe. My name is Claire. And I need to start at the beginning, even though the beginning feels like it happened to someone else. I met Nathan when I was 24. I was working as a licensed practical nurse at a rehabilitation center in Charlotte, picking up double shifts on weekends, paying off my student loans $200 at a time. He walked into the center to visit his uncle, and he stayed in the hallway talking to me for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, the vending machine being broken, whether the parking lot flooded when it rained, the kind of small talk that isn't really small talk when someone's looking at you the way he was looking at me. We dated for a year and a half. He was a project manager for a mid-size construction company. Good salary, or so I understood. He handled the finances from the beginning, said it was easier that way since he'd been managing his own accounts since college, and I was, his words, still finding my footing. I didn't push back on that. I had a lot going on. I thought it was practical. We got married in the spring. Small ceremony at a botanical garden. My mother and father there. His parents, a handful of close friends. I was happy. I remember being actually, fully happy. The kind that doesn't have any footnotes. By the time I got pregnant with our daughter, things had already started to shift in ways I didn't have the vocabulary for yet. Nathan worked later. He came home quieter. When I tried to talk about the baby, names, the nursery, whether we'd do cloth diapers, he'd engage for exactly long enough and then find something else to look at. I told myself it was stress. I told myself a lot of things. Nora was born in November, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, a full head of dark hair, and a cry that sounded like an accusation. I was in love with her the second I saw her. I held her in that hospital bed and felt something rearrange itself inside me permanently. Nathan held her once in the delivery room. He took a photo for his parents. He put her down. The months after Nora was born were the kind of hard that people warn you about but can't actually prepare you for. I was recovering from a difficult delivery, nursing around the clock, running on 3 hours of sleep, and trying to hold a marriage together that had started showing cracks I could no longer plaster over with optimism. One night, when Nora was about 6 weeks old, I woke up at 2 in the morning to feed her and noticed Nathan's side of the bed was empty. I found him in the kitchen, sitting at the table with his laptop. He closed it when he heard me coming. I asked if everything was okay. He said he couldn't sleep. I stood there in the kitchen doorway in the dark, holding a crying baby, and thought, he didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't even look up. I should have asked more questions. I should have pushed. But I was so tired. Exhaustion is its own kind of blindness. By the time Nora was 3 months old, I had not been back to work. We'd agreed I'd take 6 months, then reassess. I had no paycheck coming in. Nathan controlled our joint account, which I had access to in theory, but every time I bought something, baby formula, diapers, a pair of postpartum leggings, he had a comment about it. Not a fight. Just a comment. That seems expensive. Did we need that? Small weights placed on a scale so slowly you don't notice it tipping. The day everything ended was a Tuesday in February. Nora had a pediatrician appointment at 9 in the morning. I was packing the diaper bag when Nathan came downstairs already dressed for work, which was unusual. He typically left after I got Nora down for her first nap. He set an envelope on the kitchen counter. He said he'd spoken to a lawyer. He said the marriage wasn't working. He said he'd already moved his direct deposit to a separate account. I picked up the envelope. Inside were divorce papers. I looked at him and asked if this was really happening. He said he was sorry. He said he'd send money when he could. Then he picked up his keys and walked out. I stood in my kitchen, holding divorce papers in one hand and a half-packed diaper bag in the other, while my daughter made small sounds from her bouncy chair, and I thought, he just walked away from her. She is 3 months old and he just walked away from her like she was a piece of furniture he'd decided not to keep. I cried for about 4 minutes. Then I took Nora to her appointment, because what else do you do? I assumed, naively, that I had somewhere to go. My parents lived 40 minutes north of Charlotte in a town called Concord in the same house where I grew up. My mother taught Sunday school. My father coached Little League for 30 years. I had never in my life had reason to doubt that their door was open to me. I drove there straight from the pediatrician. I didn't even call first. I pulled into the driveway with Nora in the car seat, knocked on the door, and when my mother answered, I said, "He left us. I need help." What happened next? I have spent a great deal of time trying to understand. My mother looked at me for a long moment, then she said she needed to get my father. They came to the door together. My father said he was sorry things hadn't worked out. My mother said that she and my father had discussed it, and that they thought it was important for Nathan and me to work through our issues as a couple rather than involving the extended family. She used those exact words. Extended family. As though I were a neighbor asking to borrow a ladder. I said, "I have nowhere to go." My father said, "You're a capable woman, Claire. You'll figure something out." They closed the door. I sat in my car in their driveway for 11 minutes. I know because I was staring at the clock on my dash and I couldn't make myself move. Nora was asleep, the heat was running, and I thought, that's it. That's the whole safety net, and it just dissolved. I need to be honest about why I didn't immediately access the systems that exist for situations like mine. Because I know it's the first thing people wonder. I did go to a domestic resource center. The intake coordinator was kind. She explained that the emergency shelter in the county had a waiting list of approximately 6 to 8 weeks, longer in winter. She helped me apply for WIC, which I was approved for, and told me I could begin receiving benefits within 10 days. 10 days felt very long with $42. She gave me a list of food pantries and a phone number for legal aid to pursue child support. The legal aid office told me that in order to file for child support, I needed Nathan's current address, which I didn't have. He hadn't told me where he'd moved, and the lawyer he'd used was handling all correspondence through a P.O. box. They said it would take time to locate him through the court process. They were doing what they could. The system was doing what it could. It just wasn't fast enough to catch me before I hit the ground. I lived out of my car for 11 days. I parked in a lot behind a church that had a 24-hour bathroom in an outbuilding they kept unlocked. I'd seen a sign about it once. One of those small mercy programs that doesn't get much attention. I heated Nora's bottles with a little portable warmer I plugged into the car. I had a sleeping bag in the back seat. I fed myself from a food pantry 2 miles away 3 times a week. I kept Nora fed, clean, and warm. She didn't know anything was wrong. She still smiled at me like I was the best thing in the world, and I held onto that with both hands. On the 12th day, I was sitting on a bench outside the church, Nora on my lap, trying to get the legal aid number on my phone again, when a man sat down at the other end of the bench. He was older, early 70s, I'd guess. Silver hair, neat clothes, a wool coat. He had the particular posture of someone who had been decisive his whole life. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he asked if the baby was mine. I said yes. He asked her name. I said Nora. He sat quietly for a moment and then he said, "I think you might be my granddaughter." I almost laughed. I think if I hadn't been so exhausted, I would have. I said very carefully that I didn't know what he meant. He told me his name was Howard. Howard Calloway. He said his son, his estranged son, had married a woman named Linda and had a daughter named Claire who would be 29 now and who had become a nurse. My mother's name is Linda. I don't remember exactly what my face did. I remember that Nora grabbed my finger, the way she did when she could tell I needed something to hold. I asked him how he found me. He said he'd hired someone, a private investigator, a retired police officer he'd known for years. When he decided, finally, to try, he said it had taken about 4 months. He said he'd been trying to locate me for nearly 2 years. I asked him why now. Why after 29 years? He said, because I'm not going to make it another 29 years and there are things you deserve to know. Howard's house was 30 minutes from Charlotte in a neighborhood I'd driven through once and just assumed was where a certain category of person lived. Wide yards, old trees, houses set back from the road, not ostentatious. Old money doesn't tend to be. He had a guest room ready. I didn't ask how he knew to have one ready. Later, he told me the investigator had updated him that morning. That night, after Nora was down in the center of the guest bed, surrounded by pillows, I sat at Howard's kitchen table and he told me the story of my family that I had never been told. My father, his son, was named Thomas. Thomas had been cut off from Howard's trust at age 30 for reasons that came out slowly over that long kitchen table conversation. Thomas had forged Howard's signature on a document related to a property sale, a piece of land Howard owned in South Carolina, that Thomas had sold without authorization and kept the money from. Howard had found out. There had been lawyers, a confrontation, an ultimatum. Thomas had chosen to take what he'd taken and walk away rather than face consequences. He'd told my mother, and presumably me, though I was too young to understand, that his parents were dead. I thought about my entire childhood. Every holiday, every conversation, every time I'd asked about Howard's side of the family and been told there was no one to speak of. 29 years of a lie so complete it had shaped the entire architecture of who I thought I was. I asked Howard why he hadn't tried harder to find us sooner. He said he had tried when I was small. He said my father had moved us twice, changed our phone numbers, been very thorough. He said he'd hired someone years ago who found a dead end and he'd given up. He said he was not proud of giving up. He said a lot of things that night that I could tell he had been carrying for a long time. I didn't forgive my father that night. I'm not sure I forgave him for a long time after that, if I have at all. But I believed Howard, not just because the facts fit together, because I recognized something in the way he talked about losing contact with a child. It was the same helpless grief I felt when I thought about Nora growing up without her father choosing to be present. Some losses have a particular sound. Howard's cardiologist had told him 6 months earlier that his heart was operating at about 40% capacity. He was managing it with medication and a pacemaker and a significant reduction in stress. He was not dramatically ill. He still drove himself to appointments, still called his accountant every Friday morning, still took his dog on a slow walk around the block each evening. But he was aware of time in the way you become aware of it when a doctor gives you information you can't unknow. He had a small business, not the massive empire I'd built up in my head after he said granddaughter in trust. A regional chain of 3 hardware and home goods stores he'd built over 40 years. Not glamorous, deeply functional. The kind of business that survives recessions because people always need to fix things. He had a general manager running operations and a part-time bookkeeper, but he'd been looking for someone to eventually take on a more formal oversight role. He didn't offer me that role on the first night. He didn't offer me anything that night except dinner in a guest room, and the truth, I think that was the right call. I needed the night to just breathe. The child support process moved slowly, the way these things do. What moved faster was the family court date, which Nathan had triggered himself by filing the divorce in North Carolina. That meant the court had jurisdiction, and it meant I could file for child support through the same case, which I did, with help from a legal aid attorney named Susan who took my case on a sliding scale when I explained my situation. What I found out, through Susan's work, was that Nathan had not actually vanished. He had moved to a suburb of Charlotte, 30 minutes away, and was still working at the same construction company. He had not moved out of state. He had simply assumed I wouldn't have the resources to find him quickly, and he'd been right about that for about 3 weeks. The court ordered temporary child support pending the final divorce proceedings. It wasn't a large number. Based on his reported income, it worked out to about $840 a month. Enough, combined with my WIC benefits, and what I'd been able to save during my nursing career, to start building something real. I also filed a motion about the joint account, which had been frozen shortly after Nathan moved his direct deposit. A judge released my portion to me within a month. I say all of this not because the money was the point, but because I know people wonder how it works. And the answer is, slowly, painfully, through systems that don't move at the speed of crisis. You have to show up. You have to find Susan, or someone like Susan. You have to be willing to do paperwork while you're also surviving. I lived with Howard for 4 months. It wasn't always easy. He was a private man who had lived alone for 8 years since my grandmother passed. And I was a woman with a nursing baby, and a complicated grief, and a tendency to cry at approximately 10:40 p.m. every night for about the first 6 weeks. We were careful with each other. We learned each other's rhythms. Nora made it easier. She always does. There is something about a baby that creates permission to be soft with each other. Howard would hold her on Sunday mornings while I slept in until 7:30, which felt like a luxury I'd forgotten existed. He bought her a mobile for her crib without asking, came home with it in a paper bag like it was nothing. I cried in the bathroom for 5 minutes and then came out and helped him attach it to the crib rail. He asked me, about 2 months in, if I'd ever considered going back to work. I said I'd been thinking about it, that I'd been a licensed practical nurse for 5 years before I took maternity leave and I was good at it, that I had options. He said he had a different kind of question. He said he'd been thinking about what happened to his stores when he was no longer able to run them. He said his general manager was competent but not interested in ownership. He said neither of his other 2 children, I had an aunt and an uncle I was still processing the existence of, wanted anything to do with the business. He said he had been thinking about whether I might want to learn it. I looked at him for a long moment. I said I didn't know anything about running a hardware store. He said, "You know how to work. I can teach you the rest." I want to be clear about what the next 2 years actually looked like, because it was not a movie montage. I started part-time at one of the stores, in the accounting office, while a neighbor's teenage daughter watched Nora 3 mornings a week and Howard watched her the other 2. I learned inventory. I learned supplier relationships. I learned what a profit margin looked like in a retail context and how thin it could get during a slow quarter. I made mistakes. Ordered 3 times too much of a particular type of adhesive caulk because I misread a spreadsheet, had to negotiate a return with a supplier who was not enthusiastic about it. Howard did not make me feel terrible about the caulk. He just explained the lesson once and moved on. I got my LPN license reinstated and picked up per diem nursing shifts on weekends for the first year, both for the income and because I wasn't ready to let go of nursing completely. It grounded me. There is something about patient care that keeps you honest about what matters. Nora started walking at 13 months. She said her first clear word at 15 months, more, while reaching for sweet potatoes. Howard was at the kitchen table when it happened, and he looked up from his newspaper with an expression I still think about sometimes. By the end of the 2nd year, Howard had transferred partial operational authority to me on 2 of the 3 stores. It was formal, documented, reviewed by his attorney. Not a handshake. A structure because Howard had learned the hard way what happened when business and family arrangements weren't documented. By the time Nora was 2.5, I had an apartment of my own. A 2-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a building 6 minutes from Howard's house, with a small balcony that got afternoon sun. I'd furnished it mostly from one of Howard's stores, with his employee discount and my own paycheck. I was not a CEO. I was a partial owner and co-manager of a regional chain of 3 hardware stores, which sounds much less dramatic but is, in fact, a real thing that happened through real work over a real amount of time. I want to be accurate about that. The evening I saw Nathan again was not something I planned. It was at a charity auction benefiting the pediatric wing of a hospital in Charlotte, the same hospital where Nora had been treated when she had RSV at 14 months. A terrifying week that I had survived mostly through Howard's presence and the competence of the nursing staff. I bought a table ticket when the invitation came, partly as a donation and partly, I'll admit, because I wanted to do the kind of thing I hadn't been able to do when I was living out of my car. He was there with a woman I didn't recognize. He saw me before I saw him. I know because when I turned from the silent auction table and our eyes met, he'd already adjusted his expression into something neutral and controlled, which meant he'd had a few seconds to prepare and I hadn't. He looked the same. That bothered me more than I expected. I didn't walk away. I want to be honest about that. Part of me wanted to, and a different part of me thought, I am standing in this room because I built something in the rubble of what you did. I am going to stand here. He came over. He said hello. He said I looked well. He glanced around in a way that suggested he was trying to assess my context, who I was with, what my presence here implied about my situation. I introduced him to Howard. Howard shook his hand with the particular handshake of a man who has spent 40 years closing deals and knows exactly how much pressure to apply. He said it was nice to meet the man who had given him such a wonderful great-granddaughter. He said it with complete warmth and zero softness, which is a combination I've come to understand as Howard's particular gift. Nathan said something polite. He moved on. And that was it, mostly. There was no confrontation, no dramatic speech, no moment of public reckoning. What there was, I sat at a table at a charity auction in a dress I had bought with my own paycheck, and I watched Nathan spend the rest of the evening looking at me across the room like he was trying to figure out how this had happened. I let him wonder. My parents, my father especially, are a different and longer story. Howard's attorney, in the process of establishing my role in the business, uncovered documentation confirming what Howard had told me about my father and the land sale. It had happened. The records existed. There was no version of the story where my father was a man who had been wronged. I called my mother 6 months after moving in with Howard. She cried. She said she hadn't known about the land sale, and I believe her, mostly. Or at least I believe she'd spent 30 years not asking questions she didn't want answers to. She came to visit once, sat in Howard's kitchen and held Nora with the careful tenderness of someone who understood she had used up some of her allowance of trust. We are not close in the way I once hoped. We are in contact. My father called once. He wanted to talk about the business, about what he was owed as Howard's son, about family loyalty. He did not ask about Nora. I told him I had nothing to say to him and hung up. Howard's attorney had advised me this was the appropriate response, and for once I had no trouble taking advice. There's a thing that happens, I've noticed, when you tell people the outline of a story like mine. They want it to resolve into something clean. They want a lesson that fits on a card. And there are lessons. I'm not going to pretend there aren't. I learned that exhaustion is not weakness, but it does narrow your field of vision in ways that are dangerous. I learned that the systems meant to catch people in crisis are real and imperfect and slow and worth fighting to access. I learned that Susan, the legal aid attorney, is one of the most important people who has ever been in my life, and that I now donate to her organization every year because someone else needs a Susan. I learned that Howard is the kind of family you can also become, that it's not just about blood. It's about someone deciding you matter and then showing up, consistently, in the particular language of practical support. The guest room that was ready, the newspaper folded and left on the counter, the way he held Nora on Sunday mornings without being asked. Nora is 3 now. She calls him Pop Pop with a confidence that suggests she has always known him, which is the particular mercy of being 3. She has his stubbornness and my tenacity and a laugh that is entirely her own. I am 31 years old. I co-manage 3 hardware stores. I hold an active LPN license. I keep renewed out of something between professional pride and superstition, and I have a 2-bedroom apartment with a balcony that gets afternoon sun. I lost a husband who was never really paying attention. I lost parents who made choices I still don't fully understand. I found a grandfather who had been looking for me in his imperfect and eventually persistent way for a long time. And I found out that $42 and a portable bottle warmer and a willingness to sit on a church bench one more day is sometimes, barely, enough to be found. I don't tell this story because I want anyone's pity. I tell it because I spent 11 days in that parking lot thinking there was no one left who knew I existed, and I was wrong. I was wrong about that, and it matters that I say so. Sometimes, the person who changes everything walks up and sits at the other end of your bench and asks your baby's name. I'm so glad I told him. I've thought about cause and effect a lot since everything happened. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly. Late at night when Nora's asleep and the apartment is still. The way choices compound. The way one person's decision to lie, made 30 years before I was born, eventually landed me in a parking lot with a baby and $42. That's how far a single act of dishonesty can travel. My father forged a signature, pocketed money that wasn't his, and then built an entire life on top of that choice, including the story he told me about who our family was. I grew up believing I had no one. That was his lie working exactly as intended. What I've had to sit with is the part I played too, not in the divorce. Nathan's choices were his own. But in the years before everything fell apart, I was not asking the questions I should have asked. I let someone else manage the money because it was easier. I let myself believe that exhaustion was a good reason to stop paying attention. Tracing back from the parking lot, I can see a dozen smaller moments where I took the path of least friction. I don't say that to be hard on myself. I say it because I think intelligence isn't just about being smart in school or good at your job. It's about staying awake to your own life. Asking the uncomfortable question, Looking at the thing you'd rather not look at. Howard is 72 years old and he looked at me, a stranger on a bench, and chose to show up rather than keep waiting. That is a form of courage I don't think gets named often enough. He had been burned by his own son. He had every reason to protect himself from more disappointment. Instead, he had a guest room ready. He held my daughter on Sunday mornings. He taught me how to read a balance sheet with the patience of someone who understood that starting over is not the same as starting from nothing, because I was bringing 29 years of my own experience with me, even if it didn't look like a resume. What I learned from him is that integrity is cumulative. He'd spent 40 years building something honest, stores that sold real things to real people at fair prices, relationships with suppliers who called him by his first name, and that accumulated honesty was something I could walk into and build from. The opposite was also true. My father had spent the same 40 years building something on a lie, and by the time I was an adult, that lie had corroded everything under it, including his relationship with his own parents, his own children, his own sense of what he deserved. Nora doesn't know any of this yet. She knows Pop Pop, and she knows our apartment with the afternoon sun. And she knows that I show up every single day. That's what I want her to inherit. Not any particular amount of money, not a specific set of circumstances, but the understanding that showing up consistently and honestly is the thing that builds a life worth having. The rest of it, the hard months, the parking lot, the $42, that was the education. I wouldn't have chosen it. But I also wouldn't trade what it taught me for anything that could have come easier.